After 3 trilogies of movies, as well as multiple spin-off cinematic adventures, animated series, video games, comics, and novelizations, you would think that the story of the rise, fall, and redemption of Anakin Skywalker has been told as thoroughly as any story in the history of time.
You would think that. You'd be wrong. Because we needed this Obi-Wan Kenobi series to connect a few more dots, much more than we may have realized. Now, word of warning, spoilers are ahead for those who have not watched the new Obi-Wan Kenobi series through to completion. And additionally, I suppose if you haven't gotten around to watching or reading any of the other Star Wars stories that are out there, we're going to spoil the daylights out of those as well.
We are going to go deep into the fall of Anakin Skywalker and his emergence as Darth Vader, the iconic villain of the Star Wars franchise.
Because there's some new, very critical information from this Kenobi series we didn't even know we needed that has finally helped us understand how the heroic Jedi Knight Anakin and the horrific monster that we know as Darth Vader could both somehow inhabit the same body. So lock your S-foils in attack position, because we're coming in hot.
Your S-foils?
Yes, it's a X-wing.
See, I didn't get the reference.
While the entire Star Wars cinematic universe is essentially the Skywalker saga, the bulk of the exposition on Anakin Skywalker was explored across episodes 2 and 3, which detailed his service to the Republic during the Clone Wars as a Jedi. Now, while Anakin often came across as brash, arrogant, impatient, stubborn, downright insufferable at times, and he clearly had huge aversions to sand that was really kind of odd to share with people. The reality is, this was a boy who had been essentially conscripted into military service just because he possessed valuable capabilities that would be beneficial to the Republic's cause. His Force powers notwithstanding, he was still an immature teenager who spent his formative years being indoctrinated into a pseudo-religious system that restricted his normal and healthy appetites for love and relationships, all so he could be the most effective version of a Jedi. Basically exploited him for his gifts while restricting his personal development.
And within the growing pains of Anakin's struggle to find his identity within the complicated world around him, he was seduced by a wolf in sheep's clothing, the true villain behind the war between the Republic and the Separatists, Emperor Palpatine.
Now, Anakin was far from perfect, but his fall from grace was not merely the result of his inner turmoil or his selfish tendencies. It was due to an external presence manifested in the form of a friend, a mentor, a trusted confidant. Palpatine, Dark Lord of the Sith, had patiently infiltrated the Senate. He maneuvered himself into a position of authority. He skillfully orchestrated the downfall of the entire Jedi Order by disguising his true nature and exploiting their flawed ideology. But the corruptive influence of Palpatine was not content with merely taking down the Jedi Order by force. He wanted to turn one of their very own heroes into the very thing they were built to destroy.
And it is on this stage that the war would be waged for the impressionable soul of Anakin Skywalker. And the sad story of this seduction by the worldly wise Palpatine and transformation into the dark scourge of the galaxy would have consequences that nobody could have predicted.
Now, the question that I've always struggled with is this. How do I reconcile the previously heroic Anakin, who just days before was in the middle of saving the galaxy, with this lethal enforcer of Order 66, who heartlessly took down his friends, these trusting Padawans, and his fellow Jedi Knights? And to answer that question, we must look past Anakin's soulless eyes and into the heart of the Predator who manipulated his fears and insecurities into these horrific actions. The one who empathized with Anakin's frustration, justified his faulty logic, and exposed him to the darkness that would eventually consume him. And the most ironic part of this entire scenario was the Jedi Order who was responsible for placing Anakin in this vulnerable position with Palpatine in the first place. And as Obi-Wan Kenobi made his way to Mustafar to engage in battle with his former friend and brother, he found someone there who he didn't recognize. Anakin Skywalker wasn't there anymore. And in the Obi-Wan Kenobi series, we learned that it wasn't Obi-Wan who killed Anakin Skywalker during their epic duel. Anakin was already dead. He was the first casualty of Darth Vader.
And lurking in the shadows with blood all over his hands was the puppet master himself, Palpatine. Anakin's tragic fall and his disconnect from the heroic Jedi we all knew is a cautionary tale about a danger that is present for all of us, the danger of being disconnected from the truth and plugged into a lie without ever realizing it.
In our previous messages in the series, we looked at the dangers of becoming disconnected. But the church at Thyatira was a very unique situation. This church had all the appearances of being connected, and in many of our traditional means of measuring such things, they sure looked like they were. But similar to the gifted and well-meaning Anakin, they were being deceived and disconnected from their original purpose, plugged into a counterfeit crusade by a sinister minister, a self-proclaimed prophetess identified as Jezebel.
This church appeared to have it all, at least on the surface. They had the faith and the works, they had the love and the service, and they were growing in each of those areas. Compared to the previous churches, this group was checking all the most important boxes. Well, except for one.
One very large
Yeah.
one. They had their hearts and minds in the right places, but they had permitted a corruptive force to exist within their ranks that would result in fatal consequences. This disingenuous leader went by the name of Jezebel, and if that name sounds familiar, it should. It's a legacy name from arguably the most treacherous and wicked woman in the entire Old Testament, Queen Jezebel. The passage isn't clear if this person was truly and unfortunately named Jezebel, or maybe they had intentionally taken it as an alter ego, or maybe they were just being identified by the Lord as someone who was like the original Jezebel in spirit and demeanor.
But in all three of these possible interpretations of her name, there is one thing that is crystal clear. She was using her position of leadership to seduce the Lord's followers into a place of compromise and immorality, with fatal consequences looming for all who were guilty of partaking.
This is a very challenging concept to reconcile. As believers, we understand that the presence of sin in our lives has a corrupting influence on us and introduces us to consequences that Christ died to save us from. But the ability of this living, thriving, well-intentioned church to fully love the Lord, do His work, and still permit a pocket of sinful practices to exist is highly problematic. And to be honest, it kind of seems contradictory in nature.
Christ's warning to beware of false prophets in sheep's clothing is the key to unlocking this doctrinal dilemma. These leaders were producing fruit that looked good on the surface and was nearly undetectable as fraudulent fruit.
As a matter of fact, when they stand before Jesus at the end of days, they're pointing to the miracles, wonders, prophecies that they've done in His name with pride and confidence, fully expecting admission into His kingdom. On the surface, their fruits look like they take the top prize at any local county fair. But there's one big problem that resulted in their rejection.
They did not actually know Him and were in fact practicing a lawless version of Christianity that had introduced a false and fatal doctrine, disguising their disconnect from a life lived in submission to Christ with their fruit production in a way that would make Palpatine proud.
Palpatine didn't seduce Anakin to the dark side by convincing him to quit the Jedi Order. That would have been too obvious. Instead, like a clever sleight-of-hand magician, he slowly and methodically redirected Anakin by keeping him busy fighting in a meaningless war that was ultimately all one massive misdirection, while privately encouraging his young apprentice to indulge in self-serving practices to get what he truly desired. As the trap slowly prepared to snap shut on Anakin, Palpatine took advantage of the areas of compromise in Anakin's life that should have been confronted and corrected. A false shepherd promising that the Force was designed and intended to be used by Anakin for the satisfaction of his self-gratifying desires, no matter how misguided or unnatural they would turn out to be.
And in the climax of his seductive dance, Palpatine manipulated Anakin one final time, disconnecting the young Jedi from his intended path as a servant to others and resurrecting him as a dark and selfish being, intent on having his cake and eating it too.
Anakin Skywalker did indeed die that day, but it was not at the hand of Palpatine on Coruscant, or by the blade of Obi-Wan Kenobi in the fires of Mustafar. It was the moment Anakin willingly chose to kneel at the feet of an evil false shepherd, spreading a counterfeit doctrine of good works without obedience. And as Anakin Skywalker's knees hit the ground in his pledge to serve Palpatine, the Shakespearean tragedy was now complete. When Skywalker fell to his knees, Darth Vader rose, the inevitable outcome of following this false doctrine to its logical conclusion. As Vader revealed to Obi-Wan during their climactic duel in the Obi-Wan Kenobi series, Kenobi never killed Anakin Skywalker. The presence of Darth Vader did.
Like an electrical cord moved from one source of power to another, the slow descent of Anakin Skywalker finally reached the point of fatal disconnect when the dark presence that had been allowed to coexist within him finally took over. All because he was slowly hypnotized by Palpatine's siren song that rationalized, excused, and even subtly encouraged these dark desires.
Palpatine didn't need to turn Anakin to the dark side. He simply nourished the darkness that was already present within Anakin and kept him too busy to ever confront it and defeat the demons that would soon define and control him. And this is the message of Christ to the church of Thyatira as well. The Jezebel leadership that had infiltrated that church was spreading a false message of self-gratification, endorsing a lifestyle that not only permitted but enabled selfish, sinful choices.
Jesus did not come to save us from our sins, only to watch them continue to consume us and ruin our lives. He came to deliver us from their consequences as well as their control.
The message to the church at Thyatira is as relevant then as it is today. We must be incredibly cautious with who we allow to minister into our lives and what messages we choose to absorb. No matter how good the fruit looks, the intent of the leader influences the content they create. On the surface, Palpatine appeared to be a kind, sympathetic leader, brokering peace in a challenging time, and he took control with the best of intentions. But it was actually all a self-serving scheme that destroyed countless lives in his quest for ultimate power.
Similarly, Jezebel brought a message that mixed Christian faith, love, and works with a continual enslavement to sin that would only lead to a doom and destruction for her and her misguided followers. Both of these false shepherds were wolves in disguise, parasites gorging themselves on their unsuspecting victims, fattening them up with false doctrinal promises, and using them to suit their selfish purposes for fame, power, money, and control.
Now, are spiritual leaders perfect? Of course not. Not even the Apostle Paul claimed to have attained the fully victorious spiritual life he aspired to. But his message refused to compromise on an essential spiritual truth. While our walk with Christ is built on a foundation of faith, love, and works, it is a submissive and symbiotic relationship with our Master that aligns his purpose and power with our obedience to his will.
And while his power is absolutely present for the completion of doing his works here on this earth, the most critically important demonstration of his power is in his ability to not only free us from sin, but to deliver us from its bondage and control. As Anakin learned far too late, fruit can be deceptive when we lack the discernment to judge beyond our outer appearance.
And while Palpatine was absolutely the evil mastermind behind Anakin's downfall, he only exploited what Anakin wanted to hear, countering the messages of self-control and discipline from Obi-Wan with false promises of power to be abused without consequences. And Vader did gain power, but he lost everything that ever mattered to him, including himself, in the exchange.
Fruit should not merely be judged by the beauty and attractiveness on the outside, but its actual impact on those who consume it. The counterfeit fruit offered by Palpatine and Jezebel concealed the poison that was contained on the inside, a poison designed to feed their victims' darkest desires and encourage their sinful impulses.
As followers of Christ, we must be incredibly cautious and mindful of the leadership we submit to and the messages we ingest from them. Not everyone who speaks on his behalf or performs work in his name or even demonstrates a commitment to our spiritual growth has our best interest in mind. And if we blindly accept what is being poured into our spirits, we may consume things that are not only harmful to our growth, but encourage our participation in the very things Christ came to deliver us from in the first place.
Let's reject the comfortable and alluring deception from the Jezebel spirit that is just as alive today as well as it was 2,000 years ago. Jesus came to deliver us from our demons and break our chains of bondage, not teach us how to comfortably live with them.